Welcome to the Neurology Nuts and Bolts podcast, all about constructing your career in neurology. I'm your host, Sarah Schaefer from the Yale School of Medicine. Today, as part of the GME series, we will be speaking with two residency program directors, Jeremy Moeller from Yale and Zach London from the University of Michigan. Thank you for joining us today, Jeremy and Zach.
Thanks, Sarah. It's wonderful to be here. Thanks for having us on.
Thanks, Sarah. I'm looking forward to it.
So today we're going to be talking all about writing letters of recommendation. Now, both of you, I'm sure, have written many letters of recommendation in your careers. How do you structure them? Do you have a template or a way that you always structure a letter? And what do you think is the ideal length of a good letter? Jeremy?
Yeah, I do tend to follow a general structure. That helps me be more efficient about doing it. And I am always thinking about the reader and the purpose of the letter and how I can be most helpful to the person who receives it. So I'll usually start by telling the reader my relationship with the applicant. So whether they're one of my residents or I worked with them as a medical student, I'll tell them about how long I've known this person and in what context. You know, was this in a clinical setting? Was this to supervise some scholarly work? And all of those things I think are going to set the stage for what I put next. I'm not a big fan of the summary of the CV in the letter. I read a lot of letters that have that long list of the person's accomplishment that can be found in other places in an application. But I will sometimes write something like, as you can see in the CV, and then highlight one thing that particularly stands out or might require some context. And then I'll include some personal observations about this person's suitability for whatever job it is, whether it's residency or a scholarship or some other opportunity. And I'll try to focus the letter in context of those things. For my residents, when they're applying to fellowship, I actually also include the comments of others that I have available, highlights of evaluations that I've seen from others. And those I find useful because there's an element of authenticity. And then usually at the end, I'll have some commentary about what I think about the fit, quote unquote, fit for this person for this particular job or task. Usually I have no concerns about that and would usually be honest with an applicant if I thought that I was uncomfortable with providing a letter. So that's my general format. And sometimes I'll include some sense of how that person aligns with others who might have applied for the task, but I don't always include that information.
And what about you, Zach?
Well, I have a pretty short attention span as a reader, and so I sort of envision myself as the letter reader whenever I'm writing a letter of recommendation. So I generally try to keep letters to one page just because I don't want to have to read something that's longer than that. And that's one page, usually including my signature and the watermark at the top of the page for my institution. So really, it's probably like 3/4 of a page, single space. And I don't always follow a template. I agree with Jeremy that, there's going to be some background information at the beginning saying, I worked with this person in this context and for how long. And I think that's pretty important because you're going to get people that ask you to write a letter of recommendation after working with them for 5 days as a medical student. And you're going to see residents who you've worked with for 4 years asking for letters. And those are going to be very different in terms of the context. And I think that's important to establish. And then I usually divide the rest of it up based, on a paragraph, lots of short paragraphs, usually based on their clinical work and their scholarly work, leadership potential, other kinds of academic potential if it's something related to that, maybe something about their personality and their ability to work with others. And each of those I would put as a separate paragraph. And I like to include, when I can, personal anecdotes, things that sort of humanize it a little bit and make it clear that I know this person really well. I'm a pretty obsessive note taker when I'm working with medical students because we have to write evaluations on them after working with them for not a very long period of time. So I often have a lot of written information about specific patients they've seen and how they approached it. And if any of those stand out in my mind, particularly, I will sometimes dedicate a paragraph to a particular instance.
I wanted to pick up on something Zach said, and I totally agree with him and feel very strongly about this. I'm going to read a quote I have from James Joyce. I think I heard this once, and I'm going to be very highfalutin here. But the quote is, "In the particular is contained the universal." And that is that the way I interpret that is that very specific, minute details, vignettes of some interaction somebody had with a patient or some way that the person handled a very specific conflict can be very instructive. And this is the reason I sometimes include these excerpts from somebody's evaluation from somebody else, especially if it has sort of a very specific point. And I just think this helps connect with the reader. Zach mentioned short attention spans. We tend to hone in on these very specific things. And I'm not so concerned about the reader having to be able to relate to the exact moment, but rather the sort of theme of that. So I think these very specific points are very instructive and helpful. And when I read so many letters of recommendation and just also so many personal statements, and those that have very specific, minute elements are the ones that stay with me. So I would recommend that for letter writers to really, pick specific moments and highlight those rather than saying somebody will be a very good resident. I mean, that's going to be true of everyone.
Those are great tips. We're definitely going to get more into you on the receiving end of letters and what stands out to you. Before we get to that, though, can you tell me what you ask from a trainee in anticipation of writing a letter?
Yeah, so I ask for an updated CV. If they have it, I'll ask for a personal statement. If it's somebody I've worked with a bit, say a medical student I've worked with for 2 weeks, but don't have the same long-term relationship as I have with my residents, I'll usually ask to meet, either a phone call or an online meeting, or ideally an in-person meeting, and just hear a little bit more from them about their motivations for whatever they're pursuing, usually residency or some other opportunity. And again, getting back to my point earlier, that helps me with those very specific details. And that also can help me find out from them if there's anything specific they want to highlight or focus on. So at the very least, those things. I will tell you, one particularly overachieving medical student handful of years ago came to me and brought to the meeting a folder that had all excerpts of all of his evaluations from both his neurology and internal medicine rotations. He had his personal statement. He had an updated CV. And that was all printed out for me to refer to. It made my job so much easier. And I think I wrote a better letter. And also I was able to actually point to his level of preparation in doing that. So for those people asking for letters of recommendation, the more material you can provide for someone and the more direction you can give, the better.
Wow, something to aspire to.
Yeah, did they bring it in a clear plastic binder? Because that's what really puts you over the top, I hear.
It was actually two-toned, so it sort of had color edges, but there was a clear plastic component to it. It knocked my socks off.
Clearly a very memorable situation. You can talk about how organized that medical student is.
Well, I don't ask medical students for any additional information because typically I feel like a medical student letter recommendation is really focused on your clinical experience working with them or whatever context it was you worked with them, especially since those tend to be, in my experience, shorter relationships. There are certainly maybe a medical student that you've worked with longitudinally on a research project or something like that. And I guess that's a different story. With residents, you usually have a longitudinal relationship with them. And I'll often ask for an updated CV only to spark my memory of things about them that I may have forgotten. I'm really going to write the letter really based on my own interactions and experience with them. But sometimes I'll look at a CV and be reminded that, they participated in this committee or this outreach activity that I think actually speaks to other characteristics about them that I wanted to talk about. And sometimes that can sort of bolster my own memories and help me write them a better letter. But other than that, I try to work mostly off of what I already know about them from my experiences because, again, as Jeremy pointed out, anybody can just read their CV. We're not here to reiterate that, and that's mostly going to be filler in a letter of recommendation.
So you have both already alluded to this to a certain extent in terms of individual vignettes being very helpful on the receiving end as program directors, but are there any other things that you find particularly helpful in letters that give you a really good idea of a candidate?
Well, strong adjectives are always good. And I think that's something that is, sometimes a little bit overdone. So people use the word great and excellent a lot. But I would say when you see adjectives that are less than exceptional, I often worry about them and wonder if that's because of the letter writer or because they're trying to couch their words and actually not compliment the trainee as much. But if you see someone write things like, oh yeah, they were solid, to me reading that, I'm like, well, solid actually is probably not that good. And I think the other thing I worry about is when I see letters that are really too short. I said I have a short attention span, but I see these letters of recommendation sometimes on residents where it's really like one short paragraph. And I see that most commonly when the letter writer is probably not at an academic institution. A lot of our medical students are coming from places where they're in community programs, and the letter writers are probably less experienced. And maybe this is the first time anyone has ever even asked them to do that. And so they write a paragraph saying, yeah, it was fun to work with them. They were great. And that's it. And so when I see that, I'm left with a lot of questions still, and I feel like that's maybe doing that student a disservice.
What about you, Jeremy?
Yeah, it's tricky. I hear Zach on the adjectives, and I agree completely on that. And, it's this triangulation that you're doing when you're looking at a letter of recommendation, as Zach said. It's not just the letter. It's not just the contents. It's the person who's writing it, their relationship with the person who's applying for the program. And that can be really instructive. And then again, going back to, I really like to see details. If it's a clearly a short relationship with very vague terms, then that's not of much value to me. I don't put too much weight on that. If it's a very deep relationship and there's rich details, that's much more helpful. Sometimes, for example, it's the present, along the lines of the triangulations, it's the presence or absence of a particular letter. I always consider it notable. There may be an explanation, but I consider it notable when somebody has something in their CV that includes a very long relationship with a research mentor or some other mentor, and yet there's no letter from that mentor. I usually wonder why that is. Again, there could be many explanations, but I wonder. So it's really a matter of trying to triangulate that relationship between the letter writer, the length of the relationship, and the specifics of the contents. And then, the superlative comments, this person was in the top 5% or top 1%. Those can be helpful, but they really depend on that triangulation, on the letter writer, the way that person writes the letters, and their relationship with the candidate.
So that segues pretty nicely into my next question, which is that both of you read hundreds, maybe 1,000 letters of recommendation every cycle. And I'm sure that you can't read every single word of every single letter that lands on your desk. So what kinds of tricks can letter writers use to quickly help you figure out the strength of the applicant and the strength of the letter? I've seen people put things in bold or italics so it jumps off the page. Or Jeremy, you just mentioned the top X percent. This person is in the top X percent of residents I've worked with, et cetera. Do you find those things useful?
Yeah, I do. I'll be honest. If something's in bold, if something's italicized, if something's at the very start or the very end of the letter, that's going to pop out to me. I think I have become pretty able to skim letters and know which paragraph is simply the summary of the CV or the brief explanation of their relationship, and which parts of the letter include the more important details. But I would say that all of those things can help. Things that are bold or italicized, emphasizing those adjectives at the start or at the end of the letter. And like Zach said, keeping it short when you can help that too.
Short, but not too short.
Short, but not too short. Yeah. I think there is somebody who I think of that has historically done that particular thing very well, which is Bob Pascuzzi at University of Indiana, is famous for writing. He's written hundreds of letters of recommendation because a lot of people at University of Indiana go into neurology. And his letters were always pretty short, but they always had some very unique language in them. And I would look forward to reading them because the first sentence would always be like, something bizarre like so-and-so would be on my Mount Rushmore of neurology candidates, or, if this person was a sports car, they'd be a Maserati. He just uses these very strange, exceptional, and sort of informal statements that really grab your attention and are very memorable. And he didn't do that for everybody, but for a lot of the letters that I read from him over the years, and I've sort of tried to emulate that a little bit when I'm trying to really make somebody stand out, which of course is not every single person I read a letter for, but those that I do, I will often bold things, put some of that more informal speak, like, hey, you really want this person, like exclamation points. I mean, I'll say things that actually you would say look a little bit too informal for a letter of recommendation, because that will actually stand out as being unusual. And I think that's actually a good technique for a letter writer if they're trying to make this letter look different from all the others that they're writing.
And we've talked a little bit over the last few minutes about things not to do, like exhaustively recounting things that are in other parts of the application, like MSPE quotes for a medical student applying for residency, or exhaustively recounting the CV. I've also seen letter writers exhaustively recount their own CVs, which irks me. And as a woman, one of the things that irks me the most is when somebody says, "Dear Sir," or "Dear Sirs." And I'm the fellowship director reading this, but are there any other tips that you have for things not to do?
Yeah, Sarah, that irks me as well. The summary of the CV. I guess I get it, but it's a small enough community in neurology that we're going to know most people or be able to Google them if we need to. And I'm less interested in the profile of the letter writer than the relationship that person has with the applicant and maybe their level of expertise and experience, right? One thing I would say on that point is I'm always a little bit taken aback when somebody who's in their first year as an instructor in an academic department writes a letter and says, this person's in the top 1% of students I've worked with. And I'm like, well, I don't even know how those statistics would work, because it's very unlikely that you've worked with, 100 or several hundred students at this point. So, you think about that. Yeah, I agree with all of the other points that you've made, Sarah. So one thing I would say, just to pick up on what Zach said about something to stand out, is I do like when people include whether they would like to work with this person in a residency program, and some specific detail about that. That can be very helpful as well.
Or whether they would welcome them back as an attending after further training.
Oh, yeah, that's very helpful. I mean, it gives some look to the future. One other don't, I guess, that I would emphasize is just say no politely to writing a letter to somebody you just don't feel comfortable writing a letter to. I think it's unfair to an applicant to agree to write a letter and then write one that is bad. And we do see those occasionally. And I always think that's a little bit unfair. I realize we have an obligation to be honest about our concerns about an applicant, but that information can be found in other parts of an application, like the MSPE for residency applications, et cetera. And it always rubs me the wrong way when somebody writes something quite negative in a letter of recommendation, rather than, having the hard conversation with the applicant to say, look, I just don't think I'm the right person to write this letter for you.
You guys keep anticipating my questions. Zach, do you have anything to add to that?
Well, if I can just go back briefly to the prior question first, and then I will. I would say there's this sort of unwritten rule that every letter should be perfectly unique. But in reality, we know that a lot of letter writers are pulling up an old letter and editing it because, a lot of things are very similar about different trainees. This person is good with patients. That person is good with patients. And so you can save yourself time by sort of cutting and pasting and taking the best parts of different letters. And I don't have a problem with that. But when it becomes obvious that that's what's going on, that makes the letter writer go down quite a bit in my estimation. So when somebody has, changes genders in the middle of their letter or changes names in the middle of their letter, those are things, of course, that really stand out and make me wonder, well, maybe they don't really know this person and they're just using a template. So just be careful not to do that. I think getting to the question of whether or not you should write a letter for somebody that you don't think is stellar, there is definitely some gray zone there too. If there's a student or a resident that you've worked with that you think that you would have to say something negative to be honest, I would agree, have that hard conversation. But there are a lot of students who are kind of, the mediocre students who aren't going to get an excellent letter from anybody, but need to get letters to apply for residency. And I think if you're going to be writing a letter for those people, then it's important that they know that it might not be as stellar as perhaps they are hoping for. And I think if you can have the hard conversation with them and say, I think you were good, and I'm going to say that you were good at these things, but maybe this isn't going to be you're on my Mount Rushmore, so they understand what they're getting and then can make a decision themselves about whether they think you're the right person to ask for a letter.
Sarah, before we move on to the next question, just on this point of copying, I'll point your listeners to an article in Medical Education from 2018. The first author is Maruka-Sullivan, and it was actually the senior author was David Ross here at Yale. And it was on the plagiarism, the amount of plagiarism, both self and other plagiarism in letters of recommendation. About 5% of letters contained some degree of shared words across people. That is a polite way of saying plagiarism. And 4% were definite plagiarism. And 11% of applicants had some degree of plagiarized letters. And again, not all of that self-plagiarism. That might be borrowing wording from others. So again, I think that's helpful to know and confirms our suspicion that maybe not every letter is perfectly unique and instructive.
Jumping off of the 2 points that you all just made about writing the wrong names, not having genders be correct, and potentially not writing a letter that is as exemplary as it could be for an applicant who may not be the top of the pile. Do you generally share your letters with the applicant before you submit so that they can see what they're getting and make corrections if needed?
I don't. I think that with the AAMC, they actually like to have that statement when medical students are applying that so-and-so waives the right to see their letter. And I think that's appropriate. The exception to that rule is when residents are applying for a scholarship or something like that, where I don't have any problem with them seeing the letters in those cases. And sometimes that actually helps me sort of build a relationship with that resident because they see that I have all these nice things to say about them. But I think if you're actually trying to write someone a letter of recommendation for a job, for a residency, fellowship, or faculty position, it really, I don't think is appropriate for them to have read it ahead of time unless the person reading that letter knows that the resident has read it ahead of time. And if you're that person, then you sort of know that letter may not have as much value.
Yeah, I agree completely and don't have anything to add to that. That's exactly my process.
So we discussed what you might do if an applicant approaches you or a trainee approaches you asking for a letter and you don't feel like you could provide a very good letter for them. What if you have the opposite experience where you're working with a trainee and you feel like they're great and you feel like you would write a good letter for them? Do you generally offer to do so, or do you let the trainee approach you so as not to pressure them into choosing you as a writer?
Yeah, I offer all the time when I'm particularly enthusiastic about a student. And I always couch it in that this is simply an offer. Feel free to say no. My feelings won't be hurt, and I'll save myself some time. But I'm very enthusiastic. I would be very supportive of you pursuing this, residency or whatever opportunity. And I would write you something good. And I do say I have lots of experience in writing letters. And if you would find it helpful, please.
I agree. I'm the same way. And I would also add that when a medical student gets that offer from a faculty member, I think that lets them know that you really believe in them. And I think for the purpose of, for instance, your own recruitment, that can be very helpful. Because if a medical student knows that this faculty member likes them so much that they went out of their way to offer to write them a letter of recommendation, maybe that might even make them more likely to want to stay and do their training with you.
Yeah, I've personally found it helpful as well to offer to write a letter, not just for the reasons you stated, but also because I find it difficult to remember very specific things about my interactions with patients along with trainees, and being able to write that letter quickly after my experience with them makes it a better letter instead of, 6 months later when they're starting to apply. for their residency or other things.
That's a great point, or at least to write down some notes that you'll have for later.
Yeah, that point you brought up earlier about having a notebook, I think I might adopt that. Program directors may receive multiple letters from the same letter writer each year. And Jeremy, you alluded to the fact that you get to know these letter writers and their style, and Zach, you as well. And they write these on different applicants, maybe to the same programs. And I know that program directors could use these letters to kind of compare and contrast the degree that the letter writer might know the applicant or might be enthusiastic about the applicant. If you're in medical education and writing a lot of letters, how do you recommend making them unique?
One of the problems that program directors in general have been facing is there has been, a problem is a strong word. One of the challenges that I think a lot of program directors have been facing is there's been an increased number of applicants, and we're getting less comparative data. I think obviously USMLE step 1 is going pass fail. We're seeing a lot more medical schools going pass fail or having less comparative data within them. The MSPEs, unless they have a class rank, there's a lot of information in there that is all positive for the most part. I mean, sometimes they'll have some negative things, but you have to look really hard to find anything that is comparative. And so I actually sort of like having multiple letters from the same letter writer, either in the same year over multiple years, because you're right, I get to know them and I get to know their language, and I get to know whether there's someone that tends to use these exceptional adjectives or not. And it becomes almost like a secret code that they have between themselves and us that allows us to understand whether this truly is an exceptional candidate or not. And I don't think every letter writer wants every single person they write a letter for to be treated as if they are all equally amazing, because they are amazing in different ways, potentially. So I actually sort of like that. And I think I feel like if people were to read a lot of my letters, they would start to learn my secret code too.
Yeah, I agree. And I guess getting back to your question, Sarah, about what advice I would have for people who do write a lot of letters, I don't know that they need my advice because they do a lot of this already. But I guess if unsolicited, I would say just know what that code is and be deliberate. And if you're writing multiple letters in the same recruitment season, line them up and make sure that when you take a second look at them, they match your feelings about these candidates relative to each other.
So moving on to a little bit of a different topic, how do you each feel about the habit of some senior letter writers requesting a trainee to write their own letter and submit it to them for editing and signature? From both the side of the letter writer and the asker, what is your advice?
I had that experience as a resident. It was one of the hardest things that I have done. It's really challenging to try to say good things about yourself. I mean, maybe not for everybody, but it certainly was for me. I think the process of going through that actually was helpful. Sometimes it's sort of like doing the power pose in front of the mirror a little bit, like, can help you lick your imposter syndrome by forcing yourself to say, I am great, I am powerful. Like there was a little bit of that, I think. So it actually may have helped me on a personal level to have to go through that process. But it sure seems awfully lazy on the part of the senior faculty member, doesn't it?
Yeah, I don't know that I have anything to add, Sarah. I think as we move further in our careers, most of us have had the experience of having to do that at least some of the time, if not all the time, sort of later on in our careers. At the level of a medical student applying for residency, I think it's not optimal. I don't know what advice I have. The times it probably happens the most may be somebody who's done extensive research work and their supervisors ask them to summarize the research. I'm hoping in those cases that the supervisor has added personal comments to that letter, but it is something later in career that's very, very common practice.
From my own experience, I have both offered and asked others who know me very well and are kind of related to that senior faculty member to assist in writing the letter as a ghostwriter, if you will, so that it's not an issue of me trying to get myself to tackle my own imposter syndrome and those types of things. And also it's in the voice of somebody else.
Sarah, I think this point gets back to the point I said earlier that there's so much bias in letter writing. There are so many complicated relationships. There's so many questions about the authenticity of what you're reading. And it's just hard work to triangulate all of that. And the point you bring up, this is a practice that certainly happens. I know it happens. And it could change how you perceive the authenticity and the utility and the weight that you should give that letter.
Do you have any other parting words of advice for people as they move towards more senior roles in their careers and are asked to write more letters?
My parting advice would be around the theme of humility. We're not that good at predicting the future. We all have biases about the people that we train and that we work with. And our letters of recommendation are simply a summary of our perceptions of that person based on the things we've seen in those moments, and really nothing more. I mean, we can make some prediction about the future and about how this person's going to do. And I'm just not sure how accurate those predictions are, right? I mean, I don't know that that's been rigorously studied. So ultimately, I think all we can do is our best to describe our personal experience with that person, to frame our letter in the context of that experience, to make our best judgment about how we think this person's going to do, but to be humble and say that we don't know. And then one last point I'd make is on the receiving end of letters, I tend to make a fair number of phone calls, of follow-up phone calls, again, in that triangulation that I'm talking about. And that is, sometimes the words don't jump off the page. Sometimes the true nature of that candidate doesn't come through in the letter. And so I pick up the phone and call. And I find that really helpful to just add to that authenticity, to add to that sense of that candidate's abilities, and to get, to dig into some of the potential biases in those relationships. So, I think that this is just one of many pieces of data we have about the suitability for somebody for a job. As Zach has already said, I mean, it's just so hard, and we seem to be losing objective data by the year. And as a result, maybe the letters take on more weight, but I think we have to be humble about their full significance.
You do bring up a very important point about biases, and we as program leadership know that there's a lot of data out there about underrepresented candidates and the superlatives that are used for them versus non-underrepresented candidates, and how they're often different, and keeping those types of biases in mind, both as the writer and as the receiver of letters, is certainly extremely important.
And Sarah, as you know, I think this is not giving away too much to say that before we review applications in the residency season every year, we review some of those data about biases in letters of recommendation and MSPE, and anybody who's reviewing the applications, we make sure that we've discussed the ways in which that bias could influence these things. And I think that can't be emphasized enough. And for letter writers, I think being mindful of our own biases can honestly make the letters better.
Zach, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I love all of that. I mean, you brought up a number of great points, and I think that training in those biases actually should be something that's mandatory for letter writers. I mean, it's great for the letter readers, but I think the people who are writing it need to understand that, if your biases are to say that, women candidates are warm and empathetic, and male candidates are, genius and whatever other words. I mean, that's what some of those studies have shown, that you're doing a huge disservice to people you think you're helping. And I really like your point about humility and understanding that this is just a limited part of the process. And I think it's okay to sort of lean into that. And to some degree, that frees you a little bit to have fun a little with the letter writing, to not feel constrained to have to include specific information, to make the letter seem approachable as a way to make the candidate seem approachable. And I think that you're going to, sometimes stripping away some of that formality may help people understand the person that you're trying to write about better than if you were just trying to check every box.
You bring up a good point that faculty development exercises in this realm maybe a good use of time for departments.
Yeah, I agree. I think that would be fantastic.
Well, thank you so much to both of you for joining me today and giving us your wisdom about being on both the writing end and the receiving end of letters of recommendation.
Sarah, it was so much fun. And Zach, I loved hearing your approaches to letter writing. And I think I'm going to try to have more fun this year in doing it.
And I think I'm going to take your advice and start doing more follow-up phone calls, because the letters always say you're welcome to reach out to me, but I don't ever really actually do that. And I feel like you're right. That's a great way to help you when you're sort of on the fence about understanding what you're seeing in a letter.
Neurology Nuts and Bolts podcast was created and produced by myself, Sarah Schaefer. This podcast is not recorded as an official podcast of any institution or organization. The podcast is unfunded. Opinions are those of the individual participants. Music by Audrey Naff, artwork by Shivani Ghoshal. Want more content like this? Be sure to subscribe to the Neurology Nuts and Bolts podcast wherever you get your podcasts to hear more about constructing your career in neurology. Follow us on Twitter at NeuroBolts and on Facebook at Neurology Nuts and Bolts to stay up to date on new content and give us feedback on what you want to hear. And tell your friends. Thanks for joining us.